$85,000. That is the exact amount my parents spent on my brother's wedding. My name is Carolina. I sat at table 14 in a Philadelphia mainline country club, tracing the rim of my champagne flute. I watched my father, Edward, cry real tears under the crystal chandeliers as he raised a glass to his golden son. My phone was vibrating against my leg inside my clutch. I did not know it yet, but that vibration was a fraud alert from Experian. Someone had just taken out a $45,000 loan in my name, and the money was funding the imported white orchids suffocating the ballroom around me. Before I tell you how I exposed my own family for financial fraud, welcome to Maya Tells Stories. Tell me your age and where you are listening from in the comments, because I need to know if anyone else has survived this specific brand of betrayal. My brother Julian sat at the head table swirling top-shelf bourbon. He soaked in a celebration of his mere existence, alongside his bride Naomi, who came from a prominent Atlanta family. My father had been speaking for 12 straight minutes into the microphone. He methodically listed every minor milestone Julian had ever crossed. He praised Julian's vision as a tech founder and welcomed Naomi with open arms. I took a sip of my water. It tasted like metal. Exactly 14 months earlier, I had sat across from my mother, Sylvia, in a faded booth at a South Philly diner. I slid a thin manila folder across the Formica table, holding the spreadsheet for my own wedding. Sylvia did not even open it. She simply patted my hand, cited a tough fiscal year, and delivered a rehearsed speech about how they were stretched right now. I did not argue. I worked 60-hour weeks as a healthcare compliance analyst, tracking down Medicare discrepancies. I was used to handling things on my own. I paid for my venue. I paid for my dress. At my reception, Edward's toast lasted exactly 2 minutes and 40 seconds. I timed it later on the video playback. He mentioned the catering. He thanked the guests for traveling. He never once said my husband's name. For a long time, I thought I was the only daughter carrying this isolation. Then, last year, I read a story that went viral on Newsweek. A bride revealed her parents dropped $60,000 on her sister's wedding, only to claim they were broke when her turn came. I scrolled through thousands of comments on Reddit from women sharing the exact same trauma. A cold truth settled over me. This was not a family quirk or a tough financial year. It is systemic financial favoritism, a tax levied on the independent daughter to fund the dependent son. Back in the ballroom, Edward wrapped up his 15-minute monologue. The crowd erupted into applause. I did not clap. I picked up my clutch, pushed my chair back, and walked out the heavy brass side doors before the catering staff brought out the first course. The crisp Pennsylvania night air hit my face, serving as a welcome shock to my system. The valet brought my car around in silence. I did not want an apology from my parents anymore. I just wanted distance. Merging onto Interstate 76, I watched the Philadelphia city skyline reflect in my rearview mirror. The rhythmic thrum of the tires on the asphalt usually cleared my head. My phone sat on the passenger seat with the screen dark. Then it buzzed. A harsh, sustained vibration that cut through the quiet hum of the engine. I glanced over, expecting a text from Sylvia, demanding to know why I had walked out. The notification was not a message from her. It was an email from Experian. The subject line glowed in the dark cabin, reading, "Fraud alert. New account opened." I pulled over onto the gravel shoulder. I put the car in park, letting the hazard lights click a steady warning in the dark. I opened the email and scanned the sterile corporate text. A personal loan had just been approved in my name. The amount listed on the screen was $45,000. The air conditioning inside the Center City, Philadelphia bank branch hummed a low, relentless note. I sat in a stiff leather chair staring at the frosted glass wall of the branch manager's office. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hands remained perfectly steady. Monday morning traffic crept along Market Street outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. I did not wear my usual business casual attire today. I wore a sharp, tailored suit because I needed them to take me seriously. When you walk into a financial institution claiming someone stole $45,000, you are treated as a suspect before you are treated as a victim. A man in a blue tie gestured for me to enter. He introduced himself as Mr. Gable. He had the tired eyes of a person used to dealing with panicked customers. I did not panic. As a healthcare compliance analyst, my daily routine involves hunting down Medicare discrepancies and tracking fraudulent billing across state lines. My entire career is built on finding the lie hidden inside the paperwork. Today, I was auditing my own life. I opened my leather briefcase and placed 3 thick folders on his mahogany desk. I slid them forward, one by one, keeping my voice dead level. I told him the first folder contained my pristine tax returns for the last 3 years. The second held my bank statements, showing a consistent, unblemished history of on-time payments and a flawless credit score. The third contained the police report I filed at 6 o'clock this morning regarding a fraudulent personal loan. Mr. Gable adjusted his glasses and pulled up my file on his dual monitors. The harsh blue light reflected off his lenses. He clicked through several screens before turning the right monitor toward me. He pointed to a scanned document. It was a digital loan agreement dated 4 weeks prior. The date hit me like a physical blow. That was the exact week Julian and Naomi were finalizing their floral arrangements and catering deposits for their massive wedding. I leaned in closer to the screen. At the bottom of the 4th page sat a digital signature. My stomach dropped. It was not a generic typed font generated by a computer. Someone had uploaded a scanned image of my actual handwritten signature. It was a near-flawless replication of the way I sign my name on legal documents. But the loop on the letter C was slightly wider and more rigid than my normal fluid stroke. I recognized that wider loop instantly. I had seen it on every birthday card and holiday gift tag my mother Sylvia had ever given me. My own mother forged my signature. She likely lifted it from an old college financial aid form I left in my childhood bedroom. I asked Mr. Gable to pull the metadata and the digital footprint attached to the online application. He typed a few commands, and a string of numbers populated on the screen alongside a geographic location tag. The zip code read 19085, Villanova, Pennsylvania, the affluent mainline suburb where my parents lived. The walls of the bank felt like they were closing in on me. My parents did not simply refuse to pay for my modest wedding because they were tight on cash. They actively stole my identity and weaponized my perfect credit score to fund my brother's lavish lifestyle. The $85,000 spectacle I walked out of last night was partially financed by a heavy chain placed around my neck. They expected me to pay for the privilege of being ignored. They assumed the quiet, independent daughter would just absorb the damage to keep the peace. I thanked Mr. Gable, took my folders, and walked out into the humid Philadelphia morning. I ignored the bustling crowds of commuters and walked straight to my sensible sedan. I merged back onto the Schuylkill Expressway, heading west toward the main line. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight, my knuckles turned white. I bypassed the scenic routes and drove aggressively. The radio remained off. I needed the silence to organize my rage. The memory of my father's tearful 15-minute toast to Julian played on a loop in my mind. Every word of praise he gave his golden son was bought with my stolen money. 30 minutes later, I turned onto the long, winding road leading into my parents' neighborhood. Villanova is a place where wealth is whispered rather than shouted. Expansive stone estates sit far back from the road, hidden behind centuries-old oak trees and perfectly manicured hedges. I approached the familiar wrought iron gates of my childhood home. The gates were left wide open, swaying slightly in the morning breeze. I parked at the base of the long, circular driveway. The gravel crunched under my heels as I walked toward the towering brick facade. The estate looked exactly as it always did from a distance. The lawn was freshly cut. Expensive imported flower pots flanked the front steps. Everything projected an image of untouchable financial security and generational wealth. I marched up the stone steps, preparing to kick the door open and demand every single cent back from the people who raised me. I reached for the heavy brass handle, but my hand froze in midair. A bright neon yellow piece of paper was taped directly over the custom mahogany wood. The color was garish and entirely out of place in this pristine neighborhood. I stepped closer to read the bold black text printed across the top of the page. It was a formal legal notice from the county court. The document was a pre-foreclosure warning. I read the lines twice to make sure my eyes were not deceiving me. The bank was threatening to seize the estate due to multiple missed mortgage payments spanning 6 months. The timeline meant my parents were defaulting on their home long before they threw an $85,000 wedding for Julian. The pristine facade of the Villanova mansion was a hollow shell. They were not just stealing from me to play favorites. They were flat broke and drowning in debt. My parents were burning down my financial future just to keep up appearances for Naomi's wealthy Atlanta family. The confrontation I planned in the car suddenly felt useless. I was standing on the porch of a sinking ship. I heard the sound of a deadbolt clicking from the inside. The heavy mahogany door slowly swung open, revealing the dark, empty hallway of the house I grew up in. My mother stood in the doorway, wearing her signature silk robe, looking at the neon yellow paper, and then looking right at me. The heavy mahogany door swung open. Sylvia stood in the threshold wearing a pristine emerald silk robe. She did not look at the garish neon yellow foreclosure notice taped right beside her head. She looked at me with mild annoyance. Her perfectly coiffed hair betrayed no signs of a woman whose financial world was collapsing. She turned and walked into the grand foyer, expecting me to follow. The air inside the Villanova house felt stale. The scent of her expensive floral perfume failed to mask the distinct smell of dust and neglect. I stepped inside, and the click of my heels echoed far louder than I remembered. I looked to my left. The antique Persian rug was gone. I looked into the formal dining room. The massive oak table where we ate countless holiday dinners was missing. Faint rectangular outlines stained the hardwood floors, revealing where decades of curated wealth had been quietly sold off. I followed her into the custom marble kitchen. Sylvia turned on the espresso machine with a practiced grace. I bypassed the pleasantries and placed the Center City Bank folder directly onto the cold kitchen island. I slid the printed loan application forward, displaying the digital signature and the internet protocol address linking the crime to this exact house. I waited for the denial. I waited for her to blame a hacker or a stolen piece of mail. Sylvia merely glanced at the paperwork and sighed. She poured hot water into a porcelain cup. She did not flinch. She did not cry. She took a sip of her tea and told me I was being dramatic. The gaslighting began with surgical precision. Sylvia leaned against the counter and wove a masterful narrative of parental martyrdom. She spoke in a low, soothing tone designed to make me question my own sanity. She claimed the $45,000 loan was a necessary family sacrifice. She dared to bring up my college education. She looked me in the eye and said they drained their savings accounts to pay my Penn State tuition back in 2014. She painted a picture of 2 devoted parents giving up their retirement so their daughter could graduate debt-free. My jaw clenched. The sheer audacity of the lie paralyzed me for a moment. I did not get a free ride through university. I spent 4 years working night shifts at the Student Union dining hall, smelling like industrial dish soap while taking maximum course loads. I navigated the labyrinth of the federal student aid system by myself. I spent my 20s logging into the Navient portal on the first of every month, watching a crushing mountain of subsidized loans eat away my entry-level salary. I paid back $80,000 in principal and interest using my own wages. My parents never contributed a single dime. When I confronted her with these facts, Sylvia waved her hand as if swatting away a fly. She dismissed my financial reality and immediately pivoted the conversation to Julian. Sylvia claimed Julian was on the verge of a massive breakthrough. She used tech industry buzzwords she barely understood. She said his software startup was just weeks away from securing Series A funding from a major venture capital firm. The market was volatile, and he just needed a temporary bridge to keep the operations running. She called the forged loan a harmless administrative shortcut. They intended to pay it back the moment Julian secured his investor capital. They just needed my pristine credit score because their own credit had been ruined by the shifting economy. She spun a delusion where stealing my identity was actually an act of family unity. I demanded to know why they threw an $85,000 wedding while their house was in pre-foreclosure. Sylvia slammed her porcelain cup down on the marble counter. The sharp crack echoed through the empty kitchen. She told me the wedding was an investment. Naomi came from a prominent Atlanta family with deep ties to corporate real estate. They needed to project an image of success to secure those connections for Julian. The lavish country club reception, the imported orchids, and the Vogue photographer were all props in a desperate theatrical production. I was forced to fund the illusion while sitting at table 14 drinking tap water. I reached for the folder to leave. I told her I was taking the paperwork to the police. The air in the kitchen shifted. Sylvia dropped the loving mother act and delivered a calculated ultimatum. She reminded me that crossing state lines with digital financial fraud is a federal offense. She looked right through me and asked if I was truly prepared to send my 60-year-old mother and father to a federal penitentiary. She asked if I could live with myself, knowing I triggered a grand jury indictment against my own blood. She demanded my silence to protect the family name. The psychological trap snapped shut around me. I grabbed my keys and walked out of the house without saying another word. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind me, sealing me outside. I got back into my sensible sedan and gripped the steering wheel. I agonized over the impossible choice tearing me apart. If I reported the identity theft, the ensuing federal investigation would inevitably lead to my parents' arrest. They would face prison time and public ruin. If I kept quiet, I would be legally responsible for $45,000 of unsecured debt. My husband and I were planning to apply for a mortgage next month to buy a small brownstone in Fishtown. This fraudulent loan would destroy my debt-to-income ratio. My pristine credit score, the one thing I built entirely on my own, would shatter. My future was being held hostage to pay for my brother's past. I realized arguing with a delusional mother was a waste of time. The money did not go to her. It went to Julian. He was the beneficiary of the crime. He was the one parading around high society, playing the role of a successful tech founder. I merged back onto the highway and drove straight toward Center City, Philadelphia. Julian lived in a luxury high-rise condominium near Rittenhouse Square. The rent in that building easily surpassed $4,000 a month. I planned to march up to his penthouse, bypass the doorman, and demand he liquidate whatever assets he had left to pay off my stolen debt. The midday traffic crawled along the narrow city streets. I navigated the tight turns and parked illegally in a loading zone right outside his building. The towering glass and steel structure loomed overhead, reflecting the bright afternoon sun. I pushed through the heavy revolving doors into the expansive marble lobby. The air smelled of expensive sandalwood room spray. I expected to face a stiff security desk and a difficult confrontation to gain access to his floor. I did not need to go up to the penthouse. Before I could even approach the concierge desk, I saw her. Naomi was sitting alone on a curved velvet sofa in the far corner of the lobby. The poised, elegant bride I saw just 12 hours ago at the country club was gone. She wore sweatpants and an oversized college hoodie. Her flawless makeup was ruined by streaks of dark mascara running down her cheeks. She was crying silently, staring blankly at the polished marble floor. Beside her sat 2 large leather designer suitcases. I walked cautiously toward her, feeling the tension in the room spike. As I stepped closer, I noticed her hands were trembling. She gripped a single piece of thick legal paper, holding it so tightly the edges were crumpled. I did not know what was printed on that page, but the devastation on her face told me the illusion was already breaking. I approached the curved velvet sofa where Naomi sat isolated from the morning rush of corporate commuters. She did not notice my presence. Her eyes remained locked on a crumpled yellow document resting in her lap. Just 12 hours ago, she floated across a mahogany dance floor in a custom designer gown, radiating the effortless confidence of old Southern wealth. Now she sat slumped in a generic gray hoodie, smelling faintly of stale champagne and quiet panic. I cleared my throat to announce myself. She jumped slightly, dropping the thick paper onto the polished marble floor. I bent down to retrieve it. The bold red letters printed across the top of the page read, Order of Repossession. The asset listed below was a 2023 Porsche Macan. That was the exact luxury vehicle Julian drove up to the country club valet stand yesterday afternoon. I handed the document back to her and offered to buy her a coffee from the lobby cafe. We needed a secluded corner to dismantle the illusions our family built. We found a small round table hidden behind a row of tall potted ferns. The barista handed us 2 black coffees in plain paper cups. Naomi wrapped both of her trembling hands around her warm beverage. She took a shuddering breath and explained how her morning shattered. A heavy tow truck arrived at 6 o'clock. She woke up to the mechanical hum of hydraulic lifts outside their bedroom window. Julian tried to dismiss the scene as a simple clerical error. He claimed his accounting department missed a lease payment due to a sudden glitch in their automated payroll software. Naomi did not buy the corporate excuse. She waited for him to step into the shower and immediately opened his personal laptop. What she discovered dismantled her entire marriage in less than 20 minutes. I sat in silence, listening to a woman realize her new life was a financial trap. I understood that feeling intimately. Naomi looked at me with red-rimmed eyes and asked a simple question. She wanted to know if I was aware Julian had been unemployed for 2 full years. I nearly choked on my coffee. My brother was supposed to be the brilliant mind behind a rising health tech startup. My parents spent the last 4 holidays bragging about his venture capital pitches and rapid expansion plans. Naomi shook her head bitterly. She revealed Julian had not held a legitimate position since 2022. His supposedly thriving company consisted of a flashy landing page and a rented co-working desk he visited twice a month. The initial seed money he claimed to raise from angel investors was actually a direct wire transfer from my parents' retirement accounts. Edward and Sylvia liquidated their own future to fund his elaborate charade. They paid his luxury downtown condo lease and bought his designer suits. They engineered a fake chief executive persona for one highly specific reason. They needed to impress Naomi's father. Naomi laid out her family history. Her father ran a highly lucrative commercial real estate development firm down in Atlanta. He was a self-made pragmatist who expected his sons-in-law to match his relentless ambition. Julian knew he would never earn approval if he admitted he was a jobless grifter living off his parents' savings. So he spun a dense web of corporate jargon and fabricated financial projections. My parents backed up every single lie, validating his success. The $85,000 wedding was never a celebration of a new union. It was a calculated business expense. Edward and Sylvia threw that lavish party to convince Naomi's father that Julian was a financial equal. They hoped the marriage would legally merge the families and open the door for Julian to ask his new father-in-law for a substantial capital injection. The entire relationship was a predatory scheme disguised as a romance. A wave of nausea hit my stomach. My parents sold off their antique furniture, ignored my own wedding, and committed identity theft just to secure a wealthy mark for my brother. I set my coffee cup down and pulled the bank folder out of my briefcase. I told Naomi about the sudden Experian alert on the highway. I explained how someone forged my handwriting to secure a $45,000 personal loan. I expected her to look shocked or offer sympathy. Instead, her face drained of all color. She let out a dry, hollow laugh that sent a physical chill down my spine. Naomi reached into her sweatpants pocket and pulled out her smartphone. She unlocked the screen and opened a hidden photo album containing pictures she took of Julian's laptop screen this morning. She slid the device across the table toward me. I stared at a banking confirmation portal. A single outbound wire transfer was initiated exactly 48 hours ago. The transfer amount matched my fraudulent loan down to the penny. The destination was not a domestic business account or a vendor for the catering company. The money was wired directly to an offshore shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. The stark reality of the situation crashed over me. Julian did not use my stolen identity to pay his rent or catch up on his car payments. He funneled $45,000 into an untraceable foreign entity. Naomi leaned across the table and whispered that the rabbit hole went much deeper than a fake startup. She found encrypted messaging applications hidden in a subfolder on his desktop. Julian was communicating with unknown individuals who used numerical aliases and demanded immediate liquidity. He was trading heavily leveraged cryptocurrency derivatives using borrowed capital. When the volatile market crashed, he started taking funds from unregulated lenders to cover his massive margin calls. He owed hundreds of thousands of dollars to people who did not send polite collection letters or utilize standard court systems. The offshore wire transfer using my name was a desperate attempt to hold off a looming threat. Julian was not just a spoiled son playing business in a tailored suit. He was a desperate man backed into a dangerous corner. I realized my parents might not even grasp the full extent of his crimes. They thought they were funding a tech genius on the verge of a buyout. They were actually financing a degenerate gambler sinking in illicit debt. I needed to secure the exact name and routing number of the shell company. I reached out to grab Naomi's phone, intending to forward the screenshots to my own secure email address. Before my fingertips could touch the glass screen, a large hand clamped down hard on my wrist. The physical grip was tight enough to bruise bone. I whipped my head around. Julian stood looming over our small table. He wore a crisp, tailored navy suit that openly mocked the reality of his repossessed vehicle. His jaw was set tight, and his eyes darted nervously around the lobby, checking to see if any residents were watching our interaction. He snatched the phone off the table and shoved it deep into his jacket pocket. He did not look at his crying wife. He glared directly at me. His pristine golden boy mask dissolved instantly, revealing a cold, calculating stranger underneath. He leaned down, bringing his face just inches from mine. He smelled like expensive cologne and stale fear. His voice dropped to a chilling whisper, instructing me to leave his wife and his business alone. He warned me that I had no idea what kind of fire I was playing with, and that walking away right now was the only smart move I could possibly make. He grabbed Naomi's arm, pulling her up from the velvet sofa. She stumbled slightly, but followed him toward the elevator bank. I sat alone with a cold cup of coffee and the terrifying realization that my brother was willing to destroy me to save himself. I left the marble lobby of the luxury high-rise and walked back to my illegally parked car. The parking enforcement officer was just printing a yellow ticket. I took the slip of paper from his hand without a single word and climbed into the driver's seat. The threat Julian whispered in my ear still hung in the heavy cabin air. He wanted me to walk away and forget the $45,000 stolen in my name. He assumed I was just a frightened younger sister who would shrink under his intimidation. He fundamentally misunderstood who I was and what I did for a living. I put the car in drive and headed back to my own apartment. I live in a modest walk-up building located in a quiet, working-class neighborhood. The rent is reasonable and the walls are thin, but I pay for it with money I actually earn. I walked through my front door and bypassed the kitchen entirely. I did not need food or water right now. I needed data. I walked into my home office and booted up my workstation. The small room was instantly illuminated by the harsh blue light of dual monitors. This desk is where I spend 60 hours a week hunting down sophisticated medical fraud. As a healthcare compliance analyst, my entire professional existence revolves around finding financial anomalies. I look for phantom billing codes submitted by ghost clinics. I trace federal funds funneled through layers of corporate shell companies designed to hide corrupt doctors. I know exactly how to follow the money when desperate people try very hard to conceal it. I am trained to look past the emotional narrative and focus purely on the mathematics of a crime. Today, I was taking those investigative skills away from corrupt medical providers and pointing them directly at my own family. I sat down in my ergonomic chair and unlocked my encrypted, secure email server. During the chaotic confrontation in the lobby, Naomi managed to do something incredibly brave. Right before Julian grabbed her arm, she tapped the screen of her phone one final time. She forwarded the photographs of the wire transfer directly to my inbox. I opened the message and downloaded the attachments. They were high-resolution images of a banking confirmation portal. I dragged the pictures onto my primary monitor and began the forensic dissection of my brother's financial ruin. I ran the image files through an optical character recognition program to extract the raw text. I needed to isolate the specific routing details and the destination account numbers. The transfer was not processed through a standard domestic clearinghouse. The funds were routed using an international SWIFT code. I opened a global financial registry database on my secondary monitor and typed the alphanumeric sequence into the search bar. The system churned for a few seconds before spitting out a geographic location. The stolen money was sitting in a corporate account housed in Georgetown, Grand Cayman. The Cayman Islands are notorious for a very specific type of financial transaction. People do not wire $45,000 to Georgetown to pay off a luxury car note. They send capital there to hide it from the Internal Revenue Service and the federal government. I dug deeper into the receiving institution. The account belonged to a limited liability company with a vague corporate name. I accessed an offshore registry portal and ran a Boolean search on the entity. The results confirmed the worst fears Naomi harbored. The shell company was acting as a holding account for a massive, unregulated cryptocurrency exchange. Julian was not an unfortunate victim of a tech startup failure. He was a degenerate gambler participating in high-frequency crypto trading on foreign servers to bypass American financial regulations. When his highly leveraged positions collapsed, he received margin calls he could not cover. The brokers running these offshore exchanges do not care about venture capital pitches or prominent Atlanta families. They demand immediate liquidity, and they employ aggressive tactics to collect their debts. My stolen identity was the only thing keeping those collectors away from his front door. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the glowing screens. The scale of the deception was breathtaking. Julian committed federal wire fraud to feed a digital gambling addiction. But a nagging inconsistency bothered my analytical mind. Julian was arrogant and impulsive. He lacked the meticulous attention to detail required to set up an untraceable offshore shell company. He barely knew how to manage a standard checking account without my parents holding his hand. Someone else engineered the architecture of this theft. Someone with a much deeper understanding of asset concealment. I focused my attention back on the wire transfer confirmation receipt. Modern banking portals often include hidden metadata within the transaction details, especially when dealing with international wires. I ran a script to pull the raw code behind the confirmation page Naomi photographed. I sifted through hundreds of lines of generic programming text looking for the account recovery parameters. When you set up a high-security offshore account, the system requires a designated backup contact in case the primary user gets locked out. I assumed the creator used an encrypted alias or a burner account. I found the string of text indicating the secondary contact protocol. I highlighted the line and ran a decryption tool to reveal the masked information. The progress bar loaded slowly. My apartment was completely silent except for the low hum of the computer tower beneath my desk. The tool finished processing, and the raw text populated on my screen. I stopped breathing. The backup contact was not an encrypted alias. It was not a burner account managed by Julian. The email address displayed in crisp black letters across my monitor was undeniably familiar. It contained my mother's maiden name, followed by the exact year she graduated from college, hosted on a standard cloud server. It was Sylvia's personal email address. The reality of that single line of text hit me harder than any physical blow I had ever received. My mother was not a clueless victim blindly supporting her golden son. She was not just making excuses for his bad business decisions during our conversation in the kitchen. Sylvia was the architect of my destruction. She was the one who forged my signature because she knew exactly how to bypass the security questions on the loan application. She set up the offshore shell company. She linked her own email address to the Cayman Islands account to ensure she maintained total control over the stolen funds. My parents were active co-conspirators in a sophisticated money laundering operation. They systematically stole my financial identity to pay off illicit offshore debts because they were terrified of losing their social status. They were willing to sacrifice my future, my marriage, and my freedom just to keep Julian out of a federal courtroom. The anger I felt in the bank manager's office was entirely replaced by a cold, calculated clarity. They thought they could burn my life down and walk away without a single consequence. They forgot that I build federal cases against professional criminals for a living. I closed the email window and reached for my phone. It was time to hunt down the man funding the entire operation. It was time to find my father. I drove away from my apartment complex and merged onto the westbound lanes of the Pennsylvania Turnpike. My destination was a highly exclusive country club located deep inside Montgomery County. The initiation fee alone cost more than my annual salary. My father, Edward, spent his entire adult life cultivating an image of impenetrable success within those manicured grounds. He practically lived in the men's grill room, holding court among local politicians and corporate executives. He believed that projecting wealth was the exact same thing as possessing wealth. I knew the truth now. I knew the Villanova estate was in pre-foreclosure, and I knew my mother was laundering stolen funds through offshore shell companies. I was about to dismantle his entire illusion in front of his peers. The drive gave me time to process the magnitude of the betrayal. In my line of work, you learn that white-collar criminals are rarely masterminds. They are usually just arrogant people who believe the rules do not apply to their specific situation. They layer lies over mistakes until the structure inevitably collapses under its own weight. My parents built a precarious tower of deceit. They sacrificed my financial security to buy another month of country club lunches and luxury car leases for their son. I parked my sensible sedan between a row of imported luxury sports cars. The valet approached, but I waved him off. I did not bother checking in at the front reception desk. I walked straight through the grand lobby, ignoring the stares from the uniformed staff. The heavy oak doors of the grill room swung open, revealing a dimly lit sanctuary of dark wood and tufted leather. The air smelled strongly of expensive cigar smoke and aged cedar. It was a sickening sensory display of abundance for a patriarch who was actively drowning in illicit debt. I scanned the room and spotted Edward sitting in a corner booth. He wore a crisp pastel polo shirt and a tailored linen jacket. 3 other men sat around him, laughing loudly at a joke he just finished telling. A crystal glass holding a $40 pour of single malt scotch rested on the table in front of him. He looked like a man without a single care in the world. I walked across the room with the measured pace of an auditor entering a hostile corporate environment. I did not announce my presence. I simply stepped up to the edge of the booth and looked down at him. Edward paused his laughter mid-sentence. A flash of irritation crossed his face when he saw me standing there, ruining his afternoon leisure. He opened his mouth to dismiss me and suggest we speak later at home. I did not give him the opportunity to speak. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the single sheet of paper containing the optical character recognition data I extracted earlier. The page displayed the Cayman Islands routing numbers, the corporate entity name, and the backup email address belonging to Sylvia. I leaned forward and casually slid the printed document directly under his sweating glass of scotch. Edward looked down at the paper. I watched his eyes scan the alphanumeric sequences. I watched his brain process the implication of what I had just handed him. The arrogant facade did not just crack, it shattered completely in less than 5 seconds. The blood drained from his face, leaving his tanned skin looking sickly and gray. His hands began to shake slightly, causing the ice in his glass to clink against the crystal. The 3 men sitting at the table noticed the immediate shift in the atmosphere. They looked at the paper and then looked at my father. The silence stretched until one of them awkwardly cleared his throat and suggested they give us some privacy. They grabbed their drinks and quickly abandoned the booth, retreating to the bar. Edward and I were left entirely alone in the corner of the crowded room. He did not yell. He did not try to gaslight me the way Sylvia did in the kitchen. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood, and buried his face in his hands. The man sitting across from me was completely broken. When he finally looked up, his voice was a ragged whisper. He asked me how I found the offshore accounts. I told him I catch professional thieves for a living, and he raised an amateur. I demanded the entire truth right then and there. I promised him that if he lied to me one more time, I would walk straight out of the club and hand the folder to the federal authorities. The dam broke. Edward confessed to a reality far darker than a simple margin call on a bad cryptocurrency trade. He admitted that Julian did not just lose money in a volatile market. Julian actively embezzled capital from his initial seed investors. The people who funded his fake tech startup were not anonymous venture capitalists from Silicon Valley. They were wealthy members of this exact country club. They were the men he played golf with every weekend. Julian fabricated vendor invoices and funneled their investment capital into his personal accounts to maintain his lavish lifestyle. When the money ran out, he panicked. He took out the fraudulent $45,000 loan using my identity to cover a missing quarterly dividend payment. The offshore wire transfer was a desperate attempt to hide the remaining stolen assets before the investors demanded a full audit. The confession made my stomach turn. I asked about the $85,000 wedding. I asked why they would throw a massive party while standing on the edge of a federal indictment. Edward looked away, unable to meet my gaze. He explained that the wedding was never about love or celebrating a new chapter. It was a calculated bribe orchestrated to save Julian's life. Naomi's father controlled a massive commercial real estate portfolio down in Atlanta. Edward and Sylvia spent their last remaining dollars funding that extravagant reception to project absolute financial stability to her family. They intended to use the marriage to secure a new private investment from Naomi's father. They planned to use that new Atlanta money to quietly pay back the defrauded country club members before anyone noticed the missing capital. I was forced to sit at table 14, watching my family execute a predatory financial scheme disguised as holy matrimony. The elaborate plan failed spectacularly. Edward admitted that two of the primary investors discovered the fabricated vendor invoices late last week. They hired a forensic accounting firm and uncovered the missing funds. They did not care about the wedding or the prominent new bride. They cornered Edward in the locker room and issued a terrifying ultimatum. The defrauded investors were demanding $300,000 in restitution by the end of the month. If Edward and Julian failed to deliver the cash, the investors promised to take the fabricated invoices directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Julian would face decades in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud and embezzlement. Edward and Sylvia would be indicted as active co-conspirators for helping him hide the assets. My father reached across the table and grabbed my hand. His palms were cold and clammy. The confident patriarch was gone, entirely replaced by a terrified old man begging for his life. His voice trembled as he laid out his final, desperate strategy. He told me the only way to generate $300,000 in 2 weeks was to liquidate their last remaining physical asset. They needed to immediately sell the Villanova estate to a cash buyer. I pulled my hand away in disgust. I reminded him the house was already in pre-foreclosure. The bank was threatening to seize the property because they stopped paying the mortgage months ago. Edward shook his head frantically. He said the bank notice was a minor hurdle they could clear if they sold the property outright. The equity in the home far exceeded the remaining mortgage balance. A quick sale would generate enough liquid cash to pay off the bank, clear the $300,000 embezzlement debt, and save the entire family from federal prison. It sounded like a plausible escape route for a family composed of desperate criminals. I stood up and told him to call a real estate agent because I wanted no part in his liquidation strategy. I had my own stolen identity to repair. Edward stood up, blocking my exit from the booth. Panic radiated from his every movement. He looked me directly in the eyes and delivered a statement that paralyzed my entire body. He said they had already found a private buyer willing to purchase the estate below market value. They had the paperwork drawn up and ready to execute immediately, but a massive legal barrier prevented the sale from moving forward. Edward swallowed hard and confessed that he and Sylvia did not actually own the Villanova mansion. He dropped the final bombshell, explaining they could not legally list the property or transfer the title without securing my authorized signature first. I left the Montgomery County Golf Club and walked back to my car. The afternoon sun beat down on the hot asphalt of the parking lot. I did not drive back to my apartment. I navigated my sedan south toward Media, Pennsylvania, heading straight for the Delaware County Courthouse. Edward dropped a massive piece of the puzzle into my lap when he confessed they needed my signature to sell the Villanova estate. His admission contradicted everything I knew about my parents' financial situation. They always paraded that sprawling brick mansion as their crowning achievement. They hosted lavish charity galas in the backyard and boasted about their property taxes to anyone who would listen. They acted like the undisputed lords of a vast manor. I needed to see the underlying paperwork. I needed to read the public records and understand why my signature held the key to their salvation. The county clerk building was a stark contrast to the opulent country club I had just escaped. The sprawling government facility featured gray linoleum floors and pale beige walls. Rows of flickering fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile, artificial glow across the room. The air inside carried a distinct, musty scent. It smelled of aging archival paper, old ink, and bureaucratic stagnation. I pulled a numbered ticket from a red dispenser and sat on a hard wooden bench. I watched exhausted paralegals and frustrated homeowners argue with the civil servants behind the thick, bulletproof glass partitions. This room was the place where illusions died. This was the place where raw numbers and legal truths replaced curated social facades. My number echoed over the crackling intercom system. I walked up to counter 4 and presented my driver's license. I asked the clerk to pull the original property deed and the current title history for the Villanova address. The woman behind the glass typed the information into her outdated computer terminal. She printed a thick stack of documents, stamped them with a blue official seal, and slid them through the narrow slot at the bottom of the window. I paid the $20 processing fee and took the heavy folder to a quiet reading table in the back corner of the room. I opened the file and began analyzing the legal text. As a compliance analyst, I spend my days interpreting dense medical regulations and corporate bylaws. Translating real estate jargon was a familiar exercise. I skipped past the standard zoning maps and the municipal property boundaries. I flipped directly to the ownership conveyance section, recorded back in 2010. My eyes scanned the paragraphs, searching for Edward and Sylvia's names. I found them listed under a highly specific legal designation. They were not designated as the primary property owners. They were listed strictly as life tenants. The reality of their situation unspooled before my eyes. The $900,000 estate did not belong to my parents. The property belonged to an irrevocable trust established by my late grandfather Thomas. A vivid memory from my teenage years surfaced, cutting through the sterile atmosphere of the clerk's office. Grandfather Thomas was a pragmatic man who built a lucrative regional logistics company from the ground up. He spent his life managing freight trucks and warehouse schedules. He possessed calloused hands and an incredibly sharp mind. He never bought into the refined aristocratic persona Edward tried so desperately to project. Thomas saw my father for exactly what he was. He viewed Edward as a well-dressed grifter, a man who preferred to borrow his way to the top rather than earn his position through labor. I remembered sitting on the back patio of the Villanova house during a humid summer evening. Grandfather Thomas drank black coffee and watched Edward brag to a neighbor about a speculative real estate venture. Thomas leaned over and quietly told me that a smart woman always builds her own foundation because she cannot trust a man who builds his house on sand. I thought it was just a cynical observation from a tired old man. I did not realize he was actively structuring his last will and testament to protect the only valuable asset our family possessed. Before he passed away, Thomas placed the entire Villanova estate into a specialized trust. He drafted the documents with ironclad restrictions. He granted Edward and Sylvia a life estate, allowing them to live in the mansion for the duration of their natural lives. They could host their parties and pretend they owned the neighborhood, but they held zero equity. They possessed no legal authority to borrow against the property, they could not take out a secondary mortgage, or use the brick mansion as collateral to fund Julian's fake technology startup. More importantly, they could not sell the land. I flipped to the final page of the trust agreement to read the beneficiary clause. The text clearly designated the ultimate recipient of the estate upon the termination of the life tenancy. The sole beneficiary listed on the document was Carolina. The profound brilliance of my grandfather's foresight washed over me. He knew Julian inherited Edward's reckless ambition and Sylvia's vanity. He knew they would eventually squander any liquid cash he left behind. He locked the primary family asset behind a legal fortress and handed the only key to the independent daughter he actually trusted. The pieces of the puzzle locked together, forming a terrifying picture of my parents' current desperation. Julian embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars from the country club investors. The wealthy victims hired forensic accountants and cornered my father, demanding $300,000 in immediate restitution. They threatened to involve the Federal Bureau of Investigation if the money did not materialize in 2 weeks. Edward and Sylvia needed liquid cash to save their golden son from a federal penitentiary. The only asset large enough to cover the massive stolen debt was the Villanova house. But the bank was already issuing pre-foreclosure warnings because my parents stopped paying the municipal property taxes. As life tenants, they were legally obligated to maintain the taxes and the structural insurance. Their failure to pay those basic bills triggered a default warning from the county. They were trapped in a collapsing financial prison of their own making. They needed to liquidate the estate immediately before the county seized it or the investors called the federal authorities. To sell a property held in an irrevocable trust, the life tenants must secure a formal, legal dissolution of the trust itself. That process requires the explicit, notarized consent of the sole beneficiary. Edward and Sylvia could easily forge my signature on an online application for an unsecured personal loan. They could not forge my physical presence in front of a licensed notary and a county judge to dissolve a $900,000 trust. They needed my actual cooperation. They needed the daughter they routinely ignored to willingly sign away her entire inheritance. I closed the heavy folder and slid the documents back into my leather briefcase. I stood up from the wooden reading table and walked out of the Delaware County Clerk's office. The oppressive fluorescent lighting gave way to the bright afternoon sun. I stepped onto the concrete sidewalk, feeling an unfamiliar sensation rushing through my veins. It was not anger or betrayal or fear. It was an overwhelming surge of pure leverage. For my entire life, my parents dictated the terms of our relationship. They decided who received financial support and who was expected to sacrifice. They forced me to sit quietly at table 14 while they threw a lavish celebration for a criminal. They assumed I would always absorb the damage to protect the family reputation. They were wrong. I held the deed to their salvation inside my briefcase, and I had no intention of handing it over. I reached my sensible sedan and unlocked the doors. I tossed my briefcase onto the passenger seat and slid behind the steering wheel. The silence inside the cabin felt different now. It felt like the calm before a calculated storm. I reached for my phone to map the route back to my apartment. The screen illuminated as a new text message chimed through the speakers. The notification displayed Sylvia's name. I stared at the glowing text. Just a few hours ago, she stood in her marble kitchen, coldly dismissing my forged signature and threatening me with federal involvement. She told me I was dramatic, and demanded my silent compliance. The message glowing on my screen adopted a drastically different tone. It read, "Carolina, sweetheart, we are hosting a special family dinner tomorrow night. We want to apologize and make things right. Please come home." I read the words 3 times. The sudden pivot from gaslighting to sweet maternal manipulation was sickening. They were not hosting a dinner to apologize for stealing my identity or ignoring my wedding. They were hosting a dinner to stage an emotional ambush. They needed my signature on a trust dissolution document, and they planned to use roast lamb and fake tears to get it. I placed the phone in the cup holder and started the engine. The trap was officially set, but they had no idea who they were inviting to the table. I stared at the text message illuminating my phone screen. The words glowed in the dim light of my car interior, offering a special family dinner and a heartfelt apology. The message felt toxic. I knew exactly what was waiting for me inside the Villanova estate. My parents needed my physical signature to dissolve the irrevocable trust and sell the $900,000 house. They were setting a psychological trap designed to break down my boundaries and secure their financial salvation. I could have ignored the message entirely. I could have stayed safely in my apartment and let the federal authorities handle their massive embezzlement crisis. But I needed to look them in the eye. I needed to see exactly how far they were willing to go to save themselves at my expense. I also knew I could not walk into that mansion alone. I needed a wild card at the table. I needed a witness who understood the sheer gravity of the stakes. I dialed Naomi's number. She answered on the second ring. Her voice sounded hollow and stripped of the polished Southern charm she usually projected to the world. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told her about the sudden dinner invitation and the fabricated apology. I explained that my parents were planning something desperate tonight to cover Julian's offshore debts. Naomi grew up in a prominent Atlanta real estate family where corporate strategy often blended seamlessly with family dynamics. She knew about investment when she saw one, and her new marriage was a catastrophic liability. I sensed she was actively looking for an exit strategy to protect her own assets before the Federal Bureau of Investigation started freezing bank accounts. I asked her to attend the dinner. I told her to play the role of the supportive wife one last time so we could see the entire board before we made our next move. She agreed without hesitation. The following evening, I drove up the winding circular driveway of the Villanova property. The garish yellow pre-foreclosure notice was gone from the custom mahogany front door. They likely ripped it down the second the county clerk taped it there to maintain their illusion of wealth. The exterior of the estate projected total serenity. Warm golden light spilled from the formal dining room windows onto the manicured lawn. I parked my sensible sedan directly behind Julian's rented vehicle. I took a deep breath, bracing myself for the performance, and walked up the stone steps. Sylvia opened the door before I even reached the brass handle. She wore a soft cashmere sweater and a warm, welcoming smile. It was a jarring shift from the cold, calculating woman who threatened me with federal prison just 24 hours prior. She reached out and pulled me into a tight embrace. Her expensive floral perfume mixed with a much more powerful scent wafting from the kitchen. The air inside the house smelled heavy with roasted lamb garlic and fresh rosemary. My stomach tightened instantly. That was not a random menu choice. Roast lamb was my favorite childhood meal. Sylvia used to make it every year for my birthday before Julian entered high school and his athletic schedule monopolized her attention entirely. Cooking that specific dish tonight was a calculated sensory assault. She was weaponizing my own nostalgia to disarm my defenses. She wanted me to feel like a cherished daughter returning home, so I would willingly sign away my inheritance. I walked into the formal dining room. The space was staged like an elaborate theater set. The antique Persian rug was still missing from the floor, revealing the financial rot underneath, but the massive oak table was fully dressed. Sylvia had brought out her pristine bone china and the heavy silver cutlery reserved exclusively for major holidays. Julian sat near the head of the table. He wore a simple button-down shirt, looking intentionally subdued and humble. He did not meet my gaze when I entered the room. Naomi sat beside him. She wore a modest navy dress and offered me a brief, imperceptible nod. We were two women trapped in a room full of professional liars operating under a silent truce. Edward entered the room carrying a bottle of Pinot Noir. I recognized the label immediately. It was a vintage reserve that cost several $100s a bottle. He smiled warmly and filled a crystal glass, placing it carefully in front of me. He took his seat at the head of the table and poured his own drink. The room fell completely silent. The quiet clinking of silverware stopped. This was the moment the performance officially began. Edward picked up his glass and stood. He looked down at me with an expression of profound sorrow. He took a slow, dramatic breath and began to speak. The cadence of his voice was identical to the 15-minute toast he delivered at the country club wedding. But this time he was not praising his golden son. He focused the entire spotlight directly on me. He talked about my childhood. He mentioned how hard I worked to secure my position as a healthcare compliance analyst. He praised my resilience and my quiet strength. He looked around the table and told Naomi and Julian that the family had taken my independence for granted for far too long. He admitted that they leaned too heavily on my ability to solve my own problems. He pushed out a single tear that caught the light of the dining room chandelier. He said he finally realized what an extraordinary woman I had become, and he deeply regretted not celebrating me the way I deserved. It was a breathtaking display of emotional manipulation. Edward was validating every single insecurity and grievance I harbored for the last decade. He was offering me the exact parental approval I craved as a young girl. If I had not visited the Delaware County Clerk's office yesterday, I might have believed him. I might have drank the expensive wine and forgiven them for the stolen $45,000. I might have believed the family was finally healing. But I knew the truth. I knew the man standing at the head of the table was facing a $300,000 embezzlement debt. I knew he was terrified of federal investigators and angry country club investors. He was not giving a speech to honor his daughter. He was delivering a corporate sales pitch to secure a signature. Edward wiped the tear from his cheek and sat back down. The heavy silence returned to the room. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored linen jacket. He did not pull out a handkerchief to dry his eyes. He pulled out a thick manila envelope. The paper looked dense and official. He set it down on the polished oak table right next to his plate of roast lamb. He kept his hand resting lightly on top of the package, maintaining intense eye contact with me. He lowered his voice, adopting a tone of gentle vulnerability. He told me the family was in a slight bind and they needed to make a minor administrative adjustment to the estate. He promised that if I helped them complete this one small favor, they would immediately pay off the loan they took in my name to clear my credit score. He slowly slid the heavy envelope across the smooth wood. It came to a stop right next to my crystal glass of Pinot Noir. I stared at the brown paper, knowing exactly what lethal document waited inside. The heavy manila envelope rested on the polished oak table right next to my crystal glass of Pinot Noir. The thick paper presented a stark contrast to the delicate bone china and the elegant silver cutlery laid out before me. I reached out and pulled the package closer. The metal clasp at the top was secured by a figure 8 of red string. I slowly unwound the thread, feeling the eyes of every single person in the room tracking my movements. The dining room was dead silent. The only sound was the faint ticking of the antique grandfather clock out in the main hallway. I slid a stack of crisp, white legal documents from the envelope and placed them flat on the table. The bold black header at the top of the first page read, Irrevocable Trust Dissolution and Property Relinquishment Agreement. I kept my face entirely neutral. I did not gasp or show any sign of surprise. I read the opening paragraph, which formally requested the immediate termination of the legal shield my grandfather Thomas built a decade ago. Edward watched me read. He leaned back in his upholstered dining chair, steepling his fingers together. He adopted a low, calming baritone voice designed to project authority and fatherly concern. He explained that the family found itself in a rather complex bind. He claimed Julian trusted the wrong people in the technology sector. He spun a terrifying narrative about unregulated offshore investors who operated far outside the boundaries of standard corporate law. Edward used deliberate language to paint a picture of physical danger. He called these phantom investors dangerous loan sharks. He claimed these men were threatening Julian's safety and demanding immediate liquid capital to settle a series of bad debts. He looked at me with wide, earnest eyes and stated that the only way to protect my brother from these violent individuals was to generate a massive amount of cash by the end of the month. The only asset capable of producing that kind of liquidity was the Villanova estate. He needed to sell the house to save his son. Then my father presented the financial trade-off. He pointed a manicured finger at a specific clause near the bottom of the second page. He promised that the second my signature hit that dotted line, a wire transfer would be initiated to clear the $45,000 personal loan taken in my name. He spoke about repairing my credit score and removing the Experian fraud alert, as if he were a benevolent savior stepping in to fix a tragic administrative error. He conveniently omitted the fact that he and my mother were the architects of that exact debt. He offered to cure the poison he personally injected into my financial veins, but only if I surrendered my $900,000 inheritance to buy the antidote. I shifted my gaze across the table to Julian. My brother stared down at his untouched plate of roast lamb. He ran a trembling hand through his carefully styled hair, making himself look intentionally disheveled and exhausted. He murmured a pathetic apology under his breath. He talked about the crushing pressure of the startup industry and how he never intended for things to spiral out of control. Watching Julian play the victim triggered a sharp memory from our shared past. He sat in that exact same chair with that exact same posture during his sophomore year of college. He had totaled a leased luxury sedan while driving under the influence on a Tuesday night. He kept his head down and his voice soft, letting my parents scramble to pay the legal fees and bribe the right local officials to keep the incident out of the public record. Julian never faced the consequences of his own actions. He simply played the traumatized boy, while Edward and Sylvia cleaned up the wreckage. He was running the exact same playbook tonight, expecting me to play the role of the ultimate collateral damage. Naomi sat quietly beside him. She took a slow sip of her ice water. She did not reach out to comfort her husband. She did not nod in agreement with Edward's terrifying story about loan sharks. Her eyes tracked the movement of the documents on the table. She watched my father's hands, and then she watched my face. We shared a fleeting, silent glance. Naomi knew the truth about the offshore cryptocurrency accounts and the fraudulent wedding facade. She knew this entire dinner was a staged production. She sat there acting as a silent witness, calculating her own exit strategy, while the men in her life dug their own legal graves. Sylvia decided it was time to close the emotional trap. She reached across the table, and her manicured fingers grazed my wrist. The touch felt cold. She produced genuine tears that spilled over her eyelashes and ruined her perfect makeup. She targeted the deepest wound I carried. She talked about healing our fractured dynamic. She said this sprawling brick house was just mortar and wood, but our family bond was eternal. She promised that if I did this one brave thing, they would never ask me for another favor. She swore we could finally put the favoritism and the past behind us. She offered me the illusion of a loving mother if I just signed the paper. I played my part. I acted deeply torn. I let my shoulders slump. I looked back and forth between the legal document and the faces of the people who raised me. I reached out and touched the heavy gold Mont Blanc pen Edward had conveniently placed right next to my wine glass. The room collectively held its breath. I picked up the pen. Julian finally looked up from his plate. Sylvia squeezed my wrist slightly tighter. Edward leaned forward, anticipating the sweet victory of my surrender. I held the pen over the signature line for 5 agonizing seconds. Then I set the gold pen down on the oak table. It landed with a soft, defining click. I slid the stack of legal papers back into the manila envelope. I kept my movements slow, and deliberate. I looked directly into my father's eyes and spoke in a quiet, firm whisper. I told him I needed my lawyer to look at the agreement first. The transformation was instantaneous. The warm, loving patriarch vanished in a fraction of a second. The muscles in Edward's jaw clenched so tightly, the skin around his mouth turned white. The blood rushed to his face, painting his cheeks a dark, angry red. His calming baritone dropped into a sharp, venomous hiss. He slammed his fist onto the table, rattling the bone china and spilling a few drops of expensive wine onto the wood. He commanded me not to complicate the situation. He demanded my immediate obedience. He told me I was being ungrateful and stubborn. The mask melted away entirely, leaving nothing but pure, unadulterated rage. I did not flinch at his anger. I picked up the thick manila envelope and stood up from my chair. I looked down at the untouched roast lamb and the spilled wine. I told them I would be in touch after my legal counsel reviewed the terms. I turned my back on my furious father, my weeping mother, and my silent brother. I walked out of the formal dining room and headed straight for the front door, carrying the exact piece of evidence I needed to destroy them all. The 42nd floor of the Center City, Philadelphia high-rise offered a sprawling panoramic view of the Schuylkill River. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the morning traffic crawl along the bridges below. The air inside the law firm smelled strongly of stale, dark roast coffee and expensive leather furniture. It was the distinct scent of corporate warfare. I turned away from the glass and walked back toward the massive mahogany desk occupying the center of the room. I sat down across from Vanessa. Vanessa did not practice standard family law. She did not handle routine divorces or simple estate planning. She was a ruthless corporate litigator who built her reputation dismantling white-collar fraud and tracing hidden assets across international borders. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer and kept her dark hair pulled back into a tight knot. She possessed a brilliant analytical mind and a profound lack of empathy for criminals. That made her the exact person I needed to decipher the legal trap my parents laid out on their dining room table the night before. I placed the manila envelope on her desk. I slid the thick stack of papers out of the package and presented the irrevocable trust dissolution agreement my father Edward handed me. I sat back in my chair and waited. Vanessa picked up a red pen. She did not skim the document. She read every single line with surgical precision. The room remained quiet except for the scratching of her pen against the thick parchment and the low, steady hum of the central heating system. She turned the pages methodically. The first 13 pages contained standard bureaucratic language regarding property boundaries, municipal tax codes, and the transfer of the Villanova estate title. It all looked like a routine real estate transaction. Then Vanessa reached page 14. She stopped reading. Her eyes narrowed and the tip of her red pen hovered over a dense block of text buried deep within the miscellaneous provisions section. She tapped the paper twice and looked up at me. She asked if my father offered to pay off the $45,000 fraudulent loan in exchange for my signature. I nodded, confirming that was his exact pitch at the dinner table. Vanessa let out a sharp, humorless laugh. She turned the document around and pushed it across the desk so I could read the specific paragraph she highlighted in bright red ink. The section was titled Blanket Indemnification and Release of Liability. Vanessa explained the legal mechanics of the text. The clause stipulated that by signing the trust dissolution, the beneficiary legally released the life tenants from any and all past, present, or future financial claims. If I signed that piece of paper to authorize the sale of the $900,000 house, I was simultaneously signing a binding civil settlement. I would legally forgive the $45,000 identity theft. I would forfeit my right to file a civil lawsuit against my parents or report the forged signature to the authorities. The document framed the payoff of the loan not as a correction of a crime, but as a private settlement agreement. Edward and Sylvia were using the sale of my inheritance to buy their own immunity. The sheer audacity of the legal maneuvering sent a chill down my spine. My parents hired a highly skilled contract attorney to draft a mechanism that would steal my house and wash their hands of federal wire fraud in one single stroke of a pen. But the indemnification clause was only the first layer of the deception. Vanessa closed the folder and opened her sleek silver laptop. She had spent the last 48 hours investigating the digital breadcrumbs I uncovered in my own apartment. I had provided Vanessa with the routing numbers, the international SWIFT codes, and the backup email address tied to the Cayman Islands shell company. I assumed Julian was funneling money to unregulated cryptocurrency brokers to cover his massive gambling debts. I believed Edward's terrifying story about dangerous country club investors demanding immediate restitution. I thought my family was committing fraud out of sheer desperation to avoid violent loan sharks and federal indictments. Vanessa pulled up a series of financial reports generated by her private investigative team. She explained how the landscape of offshore banking shifted drastically after the government passed the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act back in 2010. Hiding assets in the Caribbean is no longer as simple as opening a numbered account. To move capital quietly across borders, modern criminals utilize complex networks of limited liability companies to mask the true beneficial owners. When a person wire transfers money out of the United States, the transaction triggers an automatic review by the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. My parents thought they were clever by using encrypted servers, but they left a massive digital footprint hiding in plain sight. Vanessa utilized her network of forensic accountants to subpoena the corporate registration documents tied to the Cayman Islands entity. She bypassed the standard banking privacy laws by routing the discovery request through a specialized international compliance firm. The results of that trace populated on her monitor. She turned the laptop toward me. I stared at the screen, trying to process the data. The spreadsheet displayed the incoming deposits and the current balance of the offshore holding account. The $45,000 stolen from my credit profile was sitting right there. But it was not alone. The account held a total balance exceeding $300,000. I looked at Vanessa in confusion. I told her that number matched the exact amount of money Edward claimed Julian owed to his defrauded country club investors. I assumed the balance meant the investors had already seized the funds. Vanessa shook her head. Her voice dropped, dropping an entire devastating reality onto my shoulders. She stated, there were no defrauded investors. There were no dangerous loan sharks threatening my brother's life. There was no impending federal investigation stemming from a failed tech startup. She pulled up the foundational incorporation documents for the Cayman Islands shell company. The paperwork revealed the names of the individuals holding the ultimate executive control over the offshore entity. The names listed on the screen were Edward and Julian. The air in the office suddenly felt too thin to breathe. The $300,000 debt was a complete fabrication. My father and my brother were not trying to pay off angry creditors. They created a fake financial crisis to extort me. They manufactured a terrifying narrative about impending doom to manipulate my emotions. Their ultimate goal was never to save the family from ruin. Their goal was to steal the Villanova estate. The pieces of their phantom extortion plot clicked together with terrifying clarity. They wanted me to sign away the $900,000 irrevocable trust out of pity and fear. Once the property was sold, they planned to take the liquid cash and wire it directly into their own hidden offshore limited liability company. They intended to stash the wealth outside the jurisdiction of the American court system. Then they would declare a fraudulent personal bankruptcy in Pennsylvania to wipe out their local debts and leave the country as millionaires. They were orchestrating a masterful illusion of poverty while quietly building an empire of stolen cash. They planned to leave me and Naomi holding the burning wreckage of their domestic lives while they escaped untouched. I sat perfectly still, staring at the glowing screen of Vanessa's laptop. The data in front of me outlined a betrayal so profound it fundamentally rearranged my understanding of the people who raised me. My father and my brother did not fabricate the story about dangerous loan sharks and defrauded country club investors out of desperation or fear. They invented that terrifying narrative specifically to extort me. They built an elaborate stage set filled with fake tears, missing Persian rugs, and a staged pre-foreclosure notice to manipulate the deepest core of my identity. They weaponized the empathy I possessed as the family fixer to steal the only valuable asset my grandfather Thomas entrusted to my name. For 30 years, I accepted my role as the capable, independent daughter. I quietly paid for my own college tuition. I worked 60-hour weeks analyzing complex Medicare compliance data. I managed the logistics of my modest wedding without asking for a single dollar of financial support. I allowed them to ignore my achievements while they threw an $85,000 party for a son who never built a single legitimate business. They relied on my competence to manage their crises, but they never respected my boundaries. I always assumed their neglect was a byproduct of their vanity. Now I understood their neglect was a deliberate strategy. They believed my independence made me the perfect target. They believed I was strong enough to absorb the damage of a $45,000 forged loan and quiet enough to let them sell a $900,000 estate out from under me. The mechanics of their phantom extortion plot laid bare a terrifying level of psychopathy. If I had signed that blanket indemnification clause at the dining room table, they would have immediately listed the Villanova property for a rapid cash sale. Edward and Sylvia would have liquidated the physical bricks and mortar of my inheritance within weeks. They intended to wire the massive influx of cash directly into the Cayman Islands shell company they jointly owned with Julian. Once the funds crossed the international border and vanished into the unregulated offshore registry, the final phase of their plan would commence. Vanessa laid out the inevitable legal maneuvers they prepared to execute. She explained that after the cash disappeared, Edward and Julian planned to file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy in the state of Pennsylvania. They would stand before a federal judge and declare total insolvency, claiming a series of catastrophic technology startup failures wiped out their savings. The American Bankruptcy Code is designed to offer a fresh start to honest debtors. But my family planned to exploit those protections. They intended to legally discharge their remaining domestic debts, including unpaid property taxes, massive credit card balances, and the luxury vehicle leases Naomi was currently dealing with. The court would grant them a clean slate while they secretly controlled hundreds of thousands of dollars in hidden Caribbean accounts. I realized the scope of the destruction they planned to leave behind. They were not just attempting to steal my trust fund to save themselves. They actively planned to burn my future to the ground. If I had signed that document, they would have quietly walked away from the forged $45,000 loan, leaving me legally responsible for the entire balance. I would have spent the next 5 years fighting collections agencies and struggling to repair my credit score. My dream of buying a small Fishtown brownstone with my husband would have been destroyed. The devastation extended far beyond my own life. I thought of Naomi sitting in the lobby of that luxury downtown high-rise, holding the repossession order for a Porsche she never even wanted. Julian married her purely to secure the illusion of wealth and to angle for an investment from her prominent Atlanta family. The moment he secured his offshore stash and filed for fraudulent bankruptcy, Naomi would be left entirely penniless. Her credit would be ruined through association, and her prominent family name would be dragged through the mud of a public insolvency proceeding. Julian intended to discard his bride the exact same way he intended to discard me. The warm blood in my veins turned to ice. The lifelong conditioning to protect my family at all costs died right there in that Center City high-rise office. The little girl who fixed Julian's broken science projects and the young woman who smiled politely through an insulting 2-minute wedding toast simply ceased to exist. I looked at the sleek silver laptop one last time, and then I looked at the ruthless litigator sitting across from me. Vanessa closed the screen of her computer. She folded her hands on the mahogany desk and leaned forward. The corporate lawyer dropped her professional detachment and spoke to me directly. She laid out the harsh reality of the evidence we now possessed. She stated that if we took the Cayman Islands banking data, the forged loan application, and the fabricated trust dissolution document directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the consequences would be swift and absolute. The United States government does not tolerate complex money laundering schemes designed to defraud the bankruptcy courts. The authorities would immediately freeze all domestic and international accounts associated with my family. Edward, Sylvia, and Julian would face multiple counts of federal wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. They would be indicted, prosecuted, and inevitably sentenced to serve significant time in a federal penitentiary. Vanessa paused, letting the weight of the criminal justice system hang heavily in the air. She asked me a simple, direct question. She wanted to know my play. She wanted to know if I was ready to pull the trigger on a federal investigation against my own flesh and blood. I did not hesitate. I did not shed a single tear or ask for a moment to consider the emotional fallout. I reached out and tapped the thick manila envelope resting on her desk. I kept my voice cold and steady. I told her I did not want to hand this over to the federal authorities right now. I wanted to execute the transaction my father so desperately desired. I instructed Vanessa to draft the legal papers. I told her we were going to schedule a formal signing meeting in this exact conference room on Friday morning. The trap they spent weeks building was about to snap shut on their own hands. I left the towering steel and glass high-rise in Center City, Philadelphia, and drove south. The aggressive corporate energy of the downtown grid slowly faded into the familiar working-class rhythm of South Philly. I pulled my sensible sedan into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner nestled between a hardware store and a row of old brick townhouses. The faded neon sign buzzing above the entrance cast a faint red glow across the cracked pavement. This diner was the exact same restaurant where my mother Sylvia slid a budget folder back across the Formica table 14 months ago and refused to help pay for my modest wedding. The irony of the location was not lost on me. I walked through the double glass doors and spotted Naomi sitting in the back corner booth holding a ceramic mug of black coffee. Naomi wore a simple dark trench coat and large sunglasses despite the cloudy afternoon sky. She looked exhausted. The polished Southern belle persona she meticulously maintained at the lavish country club reception was entirely gone. She did not bother pretending her marriage was anything other than a rapidly expanding disaster. I slid into the booth across from her and ordered a cup of coffee from a tired waitress holding a stained notepad. I did not waste time exchanging pleasantries or offering hollow condolences. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a slim manila folder containing the financial reports Vanessa compiled. I placed the documents flat on the table right next to Naomi's coffee mug. I watched her eyes track the movement of the paperwork. She knew whatever I placed on that table was going to alter the trajectory of her life. I kept my voice low and steady. I told her I spent the morning with a ruthless corporate litigator, reviewing the digital breadcrumbs we uncovered yesterday. I explained that Julian was not just a jobless grifter hiding from angry creditors. I presented the Cayman Islands corporate registration documents. I showed her the spreadsheets displaying the $300,000 sitting safely in a hidden offshore limited liability company. I pointed directly to the line indicating Edward and Julian were the sole executive officers controlling those funds. Naomi picked up the papers. Her hands did not shake the way they did when she held the luxury car repossession order in the lobby of her high-rise condominium. She read the offshore banking details with the sharp analytical focus of a woman raised in a prominent Atlanta commercial real estate family. She understood the mechanics of asset concealment. She understood the implications of a hidden international wire transfer. I laid out the entire phantom extortion plot my parents constructed. I explained how Edward used the fabricated threat of violent loan sharks to manipulate me into signing away a $900,000 irrevocable trust my grandfather established. I detailed the deeply buried indemnification clause designed to legally wipe out the $45,000 identity theft they committed using my pristine credit score. But the most devastating revelation was the final phase of their master plan. I told Naomi they intended to sell the Villanova estate, stash the cash in the Caribbean, and declare fraudulent personal bankruptcy in the state of Pennsylvania. Naomi lowered the paperwork. She processed the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. She realized Julian did not just lie about his fake technology startup to impress her wealthy father. He actively planned to use her prominent family name as a temporary shield while he executed a massive financial crime. When the offshore accounts were secured and the domestic debts were legally discharged through insolvency proceedings, Julian intended to discard her. He planned to leave her holding the wreckage of a fraudulent marriage while her own pristine credit profile was dragged through a public bankruptcy court. She was never a cherished bride welcomed into a loving family. She was a temporary prop in an $85,000 theatrical production. The sadness and panic that gripped Naomi earlier this week vanished completely. A profound, righteous anger replaced her tears. The women in her family did not build a lucrative Southern real estate empire by weeping over bad investments. They built their wealth by ruthlessly cutting their losses and punishing anyone who attempted to defraud them. Naomi did not cry. She took a slow sip of her black coffee, and her business instincts immediately kicked into high gear. For the entirety of our brief relationship, my father Edward constantly pitted Naomi and me against each other. He used patriarchal games to enforce a toxic hierarchy within the family dynamic. He paraded Naomi around the country club as the ideal wealthy daughter-in-law, while forcing me to sit at table 14, funding the illusion. He wanted us divided and suspicious of one another because isolated women are easier to control. The moment Naomi set her ceramic mug down on the Formica table, that toxic dynamic shattered permanently. The independent daughter and the discarded bride formed a silent, unbreakable alliance inside a South Philly diner. Naomi asked me a single, direct question. She wanted to know the exact details of the counterstrike I planned with my corporate attorney. I explained that I instructed Vanessa to draft a specialized legal document designed to mirror the exact trust dissolution agreement Edward handed me at the dinner table. The cover page and the standard formatting would look identical to the paperwork my parents hired their own lawyer to create. But the internal clauses would trigger a catastrophic legal chain reaction the second my signature hit the dotted line. I told Naomi we were scheduling a formal signing meeting at Vanessa's Center City law firm for 10 o'clock on Friday morning. I needed Edward, Sylvia, and Julian to walk into that glass-walled conference room believing they had successfully executed their extortion plot. I needed them arrogant and completely relaxed so they would not scrutinize the documents I placed in front of them. Naomi leaned across the table, her eyes hardened with a cold, calculating intelligence. She volunteered to play the most critical role in the entire operation. She agreed to attend the Friday morning signing meeting, acting as the devoted, supportive wife. She promised to project total ignorance regarding the offshore cryptocurrency accounts, the Cayman Islands shell company, and the impending fraudulent bankruptcy. She would stand beside Julian, offering him a false sense of absolute security. She would ensure the men in my family felt so overwhelmingly confident in their victory, they would walk blindly right into the center of my federal trap. Friday morning arrived with a heavy blanket of gray clouds covering the Philadelphia skyline. The weather mirrored the cold, calculated atmosphere waiting inside the 42nd floor conference room of the corporate law firm. The massive glass windows offered an unobstructed view of the Comcast Technology Center, but the sprawling urban landscape felt entirely disconnected from the isolated chamber we occupied. The air conditioning unit hummed a steady, low-frequency note. The sound vibrated subtly against the thick mahogany table dominating the center of the room. I stood near the window, taking a slow, deep breath to steady my resting heart rate. Today was the culmination of weeks spent untangling a massive web of familial deceit and financial fraud. Vanessa sat beside me wearing a tailored charcoal suit. She arranged a dense stack of legal documents into a perfectly aligned square. She operated with the calm precision of a seasoned predator preparing a flawless trap. She placed two simple black ballpoint pens next to the paperwork and pushed a glass pitcher of ice water toward the center of the wood. In her decade of prosecuting white-collar financial crimes, she had witnessed countless arrogant men walk into similar rooms, expecting to conquer the legal system. She knew how to build a corporate snare that looked exactly like a rescue raft. Today, she was bringing that wealth of prosecutorial experience to my own family reunion. I checked my watch, watching the digital numbers shift to 10 o'clock exactly. The heavy oak doors swung open, right on schedule. My family walked into the sterilized space, operating under a massive shared delusion of victory. Julian entered the room first. He looked intentionally disheveled. His usually pristine hair was slightly unkempt, and he wore a wrinkled Oxford shirt. He wanted to project the visual aesthetic of a stressed technology founder buckling under the immense pressure of demanding country club investors. He played the victim with the same effortless manipulation he utilized back in high school whenever he needed my parents to fix his academic failures. He kept his shoulders slumped and his gaze directed at the floor. He wanted me to feel a profound sense of pity, so I would willingly hand over my inheritance to cure his manufactured pain. Sylvia walked in right behind him. She wore a high-necked cashmere dress paired with her signature strand of cultured pearls. That specific piece of jewelry served as her traditional armor for decades. She wore those pearls to private school fundraisers and charity galas to project an image of untouchable mainline prosperity. She offered me a soft, trembling smile upon entering the room. Her facial expression expertly masked the stark reality of the offshore money laundering operation she personally managed from her domestic cloud account. She played the role of the worried mother, holding her fractured family together through sheer maternal willpower. Edward strode into the conference room last. He did not look stressed or apologetic like his son. He walked with the heavy, confident footsteps of a patriarch who successfully bullied his disobedient daughter back into submission. He took the leather chair directly across from me. He reached inside his tailored jacket and produced a heavy gold Mont Blanc pen. He rested his hands on the polished mahogany and began tapping the expensive writing instrument against the wood. The rhythmic clicking sound echoed sharply in the quiet room. The tapping was a calculated psychological tactic. He utilized that exact same rhythm during every childhood argument at our kitchen table to signal his growing impatience and demand immediate compliance. He wanted to establish his dominance over the physical space the second he sat down. Naomi walked in silently and took the empty seat next to Julian. She wore a simple, dark wool coat and kept her eyes locked on the table's surface. She played the part of the terrified, naive bride flawlessly, honoring the silent alliance we forged inside that South Philly diner. Her quiet presence provided the ultimate false sense of security for the men sitting next to her. Edward believed Naomi was just another asset he could control and eventually discard. He had no idea she spent the previous afternoon reviewing Cayman Islands banking records and preparing her own exit strategy with a team of divorce attorneys. Vanessa slid the thick stack of papers across the smooth wooden surface. She pushed the paperwork until it rested exactly in the center of the table, equidistant between my father and me. The cover page featured bold black lettering. The visual formatting, the font size, and the legal headers were a perfect replica of the irrevocable trust dissolution agreement my parents presented at their dining room table earlier that week. Edward stopped tapping his gold pen. He stared at the documents with a hungry, predatory gaze. He saw his financial salvation sitting right there in plain sight. He visualized the $900,000 Villanova estate transitioning into liquid cash. He imagined that cash wiring directly into his hidden Caribbean shell company. He genuinely believed the fabricated threat of violent loan sharks worked exactly as he designed it. He thought his fraudulent bankruptcy plan was proceeding without a single flaw. Edward leaned forward, resting his forearms heavily on the table. He looked at me with a sickeningly sweet smirk. His voice dropped into a low, intimate whisper meant only for me to hear. He told me I was a good girl and reminded me that family always comes first. That specific phrase carried 30 years of toxic conditioning. Family comes first was the exact justification my parents used when they skipped my college graduation to attend Julian's fraternity induction ceremony. It was the primary excuse they deployed when they refused to help fund my modest wedding, while simultaneously dropping $85,000 on imported white orchids for Julian. It was the verbal weapon they used to force my compliance whenever my independence threatened their curated social facade. Today, that phrase sounded completely hollow. He was not invoking family unity or unconditional love. He was demanding a human sacrifice to cover his criminal negligence. I did not react to his whisper. I did not offer a reassuring nod or a timid smile. I simply reached out and picked up the standard black ballpoint pen resting beside the legal documents. I actively ignored the heavy gold Mont Blanc pen my father slid across the table, offering it as a fake gesture of inclusion. The air inside the glass-walled conference room grew dead silent. The low hum of the air conditioning seemed to fade away entirely. Every single eye in the room tracked the movement of my hand. Julian held his breath, waiting for his phantom debts to magically disappear. Sylvia gripped the edge of the mahogany table, causing her knuckles to turn white under the harsh fluorescent lights. Naomi maintained her stoic stare, giving nothing away to the husband who planned to leave her penniless in a Pennsylvania bankruptcy court. I pulled the thick stack of papers closer to my chest. I flipped past the identical cover page, bypassing the standard bureaucratic jargon designed to make them feel safe and victorious. I turned directly to the final signature page. The weight of my entire past rested on the tip of that cheap plastic pen. I pressed the dark ink onto the thick parchment. The sharp, distinct scratch of the ballpoint pen gliding across the signature line echoed loudly in the silent room. The sound felt like a physical strike against decades of manipulation and financial abuse. I finished signing my name using the exact fluid stroke my mother tried so desperately to forge on that $45,000 loan application. I made sure the loop on the letter C was perfectly proportioned to prove my genuine physical presence in the room. I set the pen down. The plastic clicked softly against the wood. I did not push the documents back across the table immediately. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the reality of my actions settle into my bones. For my entire life, I operated as the designated fixer. I repaired the damage Julian caused and absorbed the financial shocks Edward and Sylvia generated. I accepted the role of the invisible daughter because I believed earning their love required endless sacrifice. Sitting in this corporate law firm, I finally realized their love was never a prize waiting to be earned. Their affection was a transactional currency they spent exclusively on themselves. I closed the folder, hiding the signed page from their eager eyes. I slid the entire package forward. The heavy paper coasted smoothly over the mahogany surface. Edward did not wait for the folder to stop moving. He lunged forward with greedy, desperate hands and eagerly reached for the documents that would finalize his ultimate victory. Edward reached across the mahogany table with greedy hands. His fingers brushed the edge of the manila folder. Before he could pull the documents toward his chest, a loud crack echoed through the glass-walled conference room. Vanessa slammed her open palm down flat against the center of the folder. The sudden physical impact stopped my father instantly. He looked up at her with a mixture of shock and immediate irritation. He was accustomed to secretaries and subordinates bowing to his physical presence. He was not used to a woman physically blocking his path. He commanded Vanessa to remove her hand and finalize the transaction. Vanessa did not move. She kept her hand pressed firmly against the heavy paper. She looked directly into Edward's eyes with the cold detachment of a seasoned prosecutor. She told him he needed to understand the reality of the situation before he took possession of the paperwork. She stated clearly and methodically that I did not sign the irrevocable trust dissolution. I did not authorize the sale of the Villanova estate, and I certainly did not grant them a blanket indemnification for stealing my identity. Edward froze. The smug, victorious smirk melted off his face, leaving a mask of pure confusion. He looked down at the folder beneath Vanessa's hand and then looked at me. Julian shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair. Sylvia touched her pearl necklace, her breathing suddenly shallow and rapid. Edward tried to recover his dominant posture. He scoffed and accused me of playing a childish game. He warned me that the violent loan sharks would not care about my petty grievances when they came to collect the $300,000 debt. I did not answer him. I simply nodded at Vanessa. She lifted her hand and flipped the top page of the document over. She pushed the paperwork back toward my father so he could read the bold black headers printed across the top of the actual forms I had just signed. The paper was not drafted by a real estate attorney. It was drafted by the United States federal government. Edward stared at the paper. The primary document was an Internal Revenue Service form numbered 211. I watched his eyes scan the text, trying to process the legal terminology. I explained the form to him. I told him it was an official whistleblower claim submitted to the federal tax authorities. The form detailed a comprehensive money laundering operation involving hidden offshore accounts and domestic wire fraud. The secondary document attached underneath was a formal submission to the Federal Bureau of Investigation detailing a $45,000 identity theft executed across state lines. I reminded him that the government pays financial rewards to citizens who expose tax evasion, turning my signature into a highly profitable legal strike. Julian practically jumped out of his chair. He pointed a trembling finger at me and yelled that I was bluffing. He claimed I had no proof of any offshore accounts and that the federal government would never waste their time investigating a family dispute. He was relying on the same arrogance that convinced him he could fake a technology startup for 2 years without getting caught. Vanessa closed the folder. She addressed my brother with a tone of pure academic pity. She told Julian that modern financial crimes are not solved by detectives kicking down doors. They are solved by compliance analysts tracking digital metadata. She informed him that we already submitted the Cayman Islands routing numbers, the international transfer codes, and Sylvia's backup email address to the federal authorities 48 hours ago. Edward tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. Vanessa delivered the fatal blow. She explained that moving illicit funds to a Caribbean shell company to hide assets from a domestic bankruptcy court triggers a very specific set of federal statutes. Because I officially reported the offshore limited liability company, the federal government invoked the Patriot Act. The authorities immediately contacted the International Banking Consortium. Every single dollar sitting in that Georgetown holding account was officially frozen by the Department of Justice pending a grand jury investigation. The color drained completely from Edward's face. The phantom extortion plot evaporated into thin air. They could not sell the Villanova house because I refused to dissolve the trust. They could not access the $300,000 sitting in the Cayman Islands because the federal government locked the account. They could not file for a fraudulent personal bankruptcy in Pennsylvania because their hidden assets were now part of an active criminal investigation. The trap they spent weeks building collapsed directly onto their own heads. They were completely broke and facing decades in a federal penitentiary. The silence in the room was suffocating. Then a chair scraped loudly against the floor. Naomi stood up. She did not look like a terrified, naive bride anymore. She stood tall, her posture reflecting the formidable strength of her Atlanta real estate lineage. Julian looked up at his wife, expecting her to comfort him or ask what was happening. He still believed she was entirely ignorant of the situation. Naomi looked down at the man she married. Her expression held no sorrow and no pity. She looked at him with pure, unadulterated disgust. She reached for her left hand and gripped the heavy diamond engagement ring Julian purchased using my parents' stolen retirement funds. She slid the ring off her finger. She held it over the polished mahogany table and let it drop. The diamond hit the wood with a sharp, distinct clatter that echoed through the entire conference room. Naomi did not raise her voice. She spoke with a calm, lethal precision. She told Julian she knew about the fake venture capital pitches, the missing investors, and the offshore gambling debts. She informed him that her family did not tolerate parasites. Naomi revealed that while he was busy practicing his fake apologies for this morning, she was sitting in a different law firm across the city. Her family's legal team had already filed an emergency petition for a total annulment based on extreme financial fraud. She was erasing the marriage from the public record entirely. She would not allow her prominent family name to be dragged into a federal indictment. But she was not finished. Naomi turned her attention to Edward and Sylvia. She told them her father was personally insulted by their $85,000 theatrical production. The Atlanta legal team filed a simultaneous civil lawsuit against my parents for damages and asset seizure. Her family intended to legally drain whatever domestic funds my parents had left to recoup the costs associated with the fraudulent wedding. Julian sank back into his chair, his hands covering his face as a quiet sob escaped his chest. Sylvia buried her face in her hands, weeping genuine tears of terror. Edward stared blankly at the gold Mont Blanc pen resting near the federal whistleblower forms. He was a man who spent his entire life projecting an illusion of untouchable power and generational wealth. Now he sat paralyzed in a sterile conference room, stripped of his assets, his social standing, and his freedom. The golden son and the arrogant patriarch were finally out of other people's money to steal. Exactly 365 days passed since I walked out of that glass-walled corporate conference room, leaving my father and my brother sitting in the ruins of their own extortion plot. I did not spend the subsequent 12 months gloating over their spectacular downfall. I did not waste my energy tracking their daily miseries or celebrating their public humiliation. I directed every single ounce of my focus toward building the exact life they tried so desperately to steal from me. The warm evening air filling the backyard of my newly purchased Philadelphia brownstone smelled strongly of hickory wood smoke and roasting vegetables. I stood on the custom cedar deck adjusting a row of warm amber string lights draped above the patio seating area. The neighborhood of Fishtown hummed with the vibrant, energetic noise of a Friday night in the city. Faint music drifted over the brick privacy walls, blending seamlessly with the sound of genuine laughter echoing from my own guests. This space was entirely mine. I did not inherit the historic property, and I did not rely on a fraudulent financial bridge to secure the mortgage. I bought the real estate using a pristine credit score and a substantial down payment generated by my own analytical skills. I walked over to the outdoor dining table and picked up a heavy glass bottle of vintage red wine. I pulled the cork and poured a generous measure into my crystal glass. I bought the expensive vintage myself to celebrate my 1-year wedding anniversary. It was a stark departure from the cheap tap water I drank at table 14 during Julian's lavish country club reception. Every single item in this backyard, from the imported patio furniture to the premium cuts of meat sizzling on the grill, belonged to me and my husband. He stood a few feet away, managing the charcoal fire and joking with our neighbors. He was the man my father refused to acknowledge during that insulting 2-minute wedding toast. Today, he was the co-architect of a peaceful sanctuary, impenetrable to my toxic relatives. A familiar face emerged from the sliding glass back door carrying a tray of appetizers. Naomi stepped onto the deck wearing a sharp, casual blazer and a brilliant, relaxed smile. She looked entirely different from the terrified bride holding a luxury car repossession order in a downtown lobby. The prominent Atlanta legal team her family employed executed her marriage annulment with breathtaking speed and ruthless efficiency. They erased Julian from her public record before the ink on the federal indictments even dried. She relocated to Philadelphia, permanently transferring her corporate real estate skills to a massive commercial development firm operating in Center City. We never discussed the $85,000 wedding or the fabricated venture capital pitches anymore. We forged a permanent chosen family out of the collateral damage my parents left behind. I took a slow sip of the rich red wine, letting the complex flavors settle on my palate. I felt a slight vibration in the pocket of my denim jacket. I pulled out my smartphone and glanced at the glowing screen, expecting a text message from another arriving guest. Instead, a customized news alert populated on the digital display. I had set a specific keyword tracker on the local federal court docket months ago to monitor the ongoing legal proceedings. The automated headline delivered the final, conclusive chapter of the saga. The Department of Justice officially announced that former Montgomery County Executive Edward and his son Julian accepted formal plea agreements regarding multiple counts of federal wire fraud and international asset concealment. The criminal trial was completely averted. The overwhelming forensic evidence provided by the Cayman Islands Banking Consortium left their defense attorneys with absolutely no viable strategy. The men who spent their entire lives projecting an illusion of untouchable power surrendered to the federal government to avoid a lengthy public trial. They were scheduled for transfer to a low-security federal correctional institution in central Pennsylvania by the end of the month. They traded their tailored linen jackets and expensive country club lunches for standardized uniforms and rigid daily schedules. The Golden Son and the arrogant patriarch were finally facing the absolute boundaries of the American legal system. The financial fallout surrounding their conviction carried a profound sense of poetic justice. When the federal authorities froze the Caribbean Shell Company under the Patriot Act, they officially seized the stolen $300,000. Because I filed the proper Internal Revenue Service whistleblower forms, my corporate litigator Vanessa secured a percentage of the recovered assets as a federally mandated reward. The government cut me a certified check for exposing the tax evasion. I used that exact money to finalize the down payment on the Fishtown brownstone I was currently standing in. I literally financed my new home using the financial penalties extracted from the people who tried to destroy my future. The Villanova estate met a similarly satisfying fate. The county tax authorities officially executed the foreclosure warrant when Edward and Sylvia failed to cure their municipal debts. Because my parents were stripped of their life tenancy rights due to gross financial negligence, the Irrevocable Trust automatically transferred the remaining equity directly to me. I instructed the trust managers to liquidate the sprawling brick mansion and sell the land to a commercial developer. The physical monument to my parents' vanity was completely leveled to make way for a modern housing subdivision. Sylvia did not go to federal prison. She managed to avoid a criminal indictment by claiming total ignorance regarding the offshore accounts, playing the role of the devoted but clueless housewife. The federal prosecutors declined to pursue charges against her, focusing their resources entirely on the primary architects of the fraud. But avoiding a prison cell did not save her from the devastating consequences of her own enabling behavior. Stripped of the Villanova mansion and entirely cut off from the Montgomery County elite, she was forced to relocate. She currently lived in a cramped one-bedroom apartment in a noisy complex located deep inside Delaware County. Her signature cultured pearls and her emerald silk robes were useless artifacts in a neighborhood defined by working-class reality. She was completely isolated, living entirely on a meager fixed income with no golden sun left to worship. I swiped the news notification away, clearing the screen. I did not feel a sudden rush of vindictive joy. I simply felt an overwhelming sense of profound closure. The heavy chain I dragged around for 3 decades was finally broken. The lifelong conditioning demanding I fix their mistakes and absorb their debts was permanently erased from my psychological programming. Just as I prepared to slide the device back into my pocket, the screen illuminated once again. The phone vibrated violently against my palm, signaling an incoming voice call. The caller identification system could not attach a registered name to the number. The screen simply displayed a generic geographic location linked to the area code. The incoming call originated from Delaware County. I stared at the 10-digit number glowing brightly in the dim evening light. I knew exactly who was sitting in a cramped apartment miles away, dialing my phone. Sylvia was likely calling to beg for a temporary financial bridge to cover her monthly rent. She was likely preparing to weave a new manipulative narrative about family unity and forgiveness now that her husband and her son were heading to a federal penitentiary. The woman who forged my signature and tried to steal my inheritance was reaching out to the independent daughter, hoping to find the obedient family fixer she created. The old version of myself might have answered that call. The terrified younger sister who sat quietly at table 14 might have picked up the phone out of a misplaced sense of filial obligation. I might have listened to the weeping and the gaslighting and offered a small sliver of financial support just to make the painful conversation stop. I did not answer the phone. I looked across the cedar deck. My husband was laughing loudly at a joke Naomi just told. The string lights cast a warm, inviting glow over the people who actively chose to respect my boundaries and value my presence. I looked back down at the vibrating device in my hand. I pressed my thumb firmly against the red icon disconnecting the call instantly. I opened the settings menu, selected the Delaware County number, and tapped the option to block the caller permanently. I dropped the silenced phone back into my pocket. I raised my crystal glass of vintage red wine to my lips and took a final, satisfying sip. I turned my back on the past and walked across the wooden deck to join my family. The ultimate American payoff was not the federal reward money or the liquidated trust fund. The ultimate payoff was the absolute quiet peace bought and paid for by my own unbreakable boundaries. Looking back at the smoldering wreckage of my family tree, I do not feel a single ounce of regret. I feel an overwhelming sense of clarity. The journey from sitting silently at table 14, drinking tap water at an $85,000 wedding, to holding the deed of my own Philadelphia brownstone taught me that survival requires more than just resilience. It requires absolute ruthlessness when dealing with financial predators disguised as blood relatives. I walked away from that glass-walled conference room with 5 undeniable truths etched permanently into my mind. First, conditional love is the most expensive debt you can possibly carry. If someone requires you to sacrifice your financial future to earn their affection, they do not love you. They are simply utilizing you as a human shield. Build your own foundation so you never have to negotiate your basic worth. Second, the golden child syndrome is a devastating curse rather than a blessing. My parents genuinely believed they were helping Julian by funding his lavish illusions and fixing his continuous mistakes. Instead, they engineered his total destruction. Shielding a grown adult from the consequences of their actions only creates a dependent liability capable of committing federal wire fraud. Third, always monitor your financial identity with relentless vigilance. That single Experian fraud alert flashing on the dark highway saved my entire future. Do not blindly trust the people who raised you with your social security number or your pristine credit profile. The most devastating identity theft often originates from inside your own house. Fourth, secure your hard-earned assets with ironclad legal boundaries. Grandfather Thomas knew a polite handshake meant absolutely nothing to a seasoned grifter like my father. He protected his generational legacy by utilizing an irrevocable trust. If you have wealth, protect it with aggressive legal structures, because financial desperation makes monsters out of ordinary people. Fifth and finally, biology does not dictate loyalty. My true family is not sitting in a low-security federal penitentiary or a cramped Delaware County apartment. My real family consists of my husband, who stood by my side, and Naomi, the brilliant sister I gained in the crossfire. We actively chose each other when the biological ties completely rotted away. Before I turn off the patio lights and enjoy the quiet peace of my new life, I want to officially welcome you to Maya Tells Stories. Sharing this incredibly dark chapter was not easy, but exposing the truth is the only way to dismantle the toxic shame surrounding family financial abuse. I know Sylvia is currently plotting her next manipulative move from her isolated apartment, and Julian's federal sentencing hearing is rapidly approaching. If you want me to make part 2 detailing the chaotic fallout of their federal criminal trial, remember to subscribe so you do not miss it. Tell me in the comments which of the 5 lessons resonated with your own life experience. Thank you for listening, and remember to always protect your peace.